Thank you for joining today's webinar on the continuity of energy efficiency programs in Minnesota during the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Ben Passer, and I'm the Director of Energy Access and Equity at Fresh Energy. Fresh Energy is a nonprofit energy policy organization in St. Paul. In just a minute, I'll recognize the rest of our co-hosts and partners who are involved in planning this webinar. But first, I'd like to cover a bit of housekeeping and walk through the agenda. Today's webinar is the first of a two-part series focused on the impacts of COVID-19 in the energy and housing sectors. Throughout the webinar, all participants will have their audio muted to ensure that there's no background noise during the presentations and during the Q&A. It doesn't hurt to make sure you're muted on your end as well, just to be safe. You don't need to have your video turned on, but you're welcome to turn your camera on if you're asking a question during the Q&A section if you'd like. Please share your questions using the chat function on your screen, and we will add them to the list on our end for the Q&A section of the agenda. I'll be compiling those and asking questions of the presenters during that part of the agenda. There will be a 10-minute break about halfway through the agenda, and the Q&A section will occur after all of the presenters speak. This webinar is also being recorded, and we will send out information on how to access the recording after today. Let's jump to the next slide so I can briefly cover the purpose of today's webinar. And then after that, I'll turn it over to Maddie Wazowitz from the Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance to give an overview of utility program responses to COVID-19 in the Midwest. Then we'll hear from Anthony Fryer and Jake McAlpine from the Minnesota Department of Commerce Division of Energy Resources, who will share an overview of statewide discussions regarding the Conservation Improvement Program and safe work practices. After a 10-minute break, we'll hear from 3 utility representatives on their responses to COVID-19. Emma Shoppy from CenterPoint Energy, Justin Johns from East Central Energy, and Paul Twite from Delano Public Utilities. We'll then hear from Metric Giles from Community Stabilization Project about housing impacts from COVID-19. And finally, we'll have some time for Q&A with all of our speakers, so don't forget to drop your questions in the chat. Next slide. I'd like to thank all of our partners and co-hosts who helped plan and organize today's webinar. Minnesota Department of Commerce Division of Energy Resources, Minnesota Housing, members of the Minnesota Multifamily Affordable Housing Energy Network, including CenterPoint Energy, Community Stabilization Project, Fresh Energy, Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance, Minnesota Housing Partnership, the National Housing Trust, and the Natural Resources Defense Council, the Association of Energy Services Professionals Midwest, Delano Public Utilities, and East Central Energy. You'll be hearing from some of these folks throughout the webinar, but others are helping behind the scenes. So I wanted to make sure to recognize and thank everyone at this time. Next, just a refresher on the purpose of today's webinar before I turn it over to our first presenter. Today's webinar will share information about efforts to continue the safe, reliable delivery of residential energy efficiency programs during the COVID-19 pandemic. It will also provide an overview of state policy changes being considered in response to the pandemic and highlight key actions being taken in the utility and housing sectors. This webinar is presentation focused, so please save the date for a follow-up discussion focused forum on July 15th from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. And now, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Maddie Wazowitz to give us an overview of utility program responses to COVID-19 in the Midwest.
Thanks, Ben. Hello, everyone. I'm Maddie Wazowitz, like Ben said, a policy associate for the Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance, or MEA. Go to the next slide. One more. Thanks. For those of you who are unfamiliar with us, MEA is a nonprofit membership organization. Our 160 plus members include state and local governments, nonprofit and advocacy organizations, utilities, implementers, and evaluators. Our goal at MEA is to advocate for energy efficiency in our 13-state territory by championing the environmental, economic, and utility system benefits of cost-effective energy efficiency. Next slide. So how do we do that? We work to research, collect data, and study legislation and regulation to best advocate and educate on energy efficiency. Because we do bring so many stakeholders together in the region, we felt we were positioned to help understand and disseminate the impacts of COVID on our industry. Next slide. Here's a quick agenda of what we'll talk about today. I'll briefly cover the state and the Midwest, then regional policy responses, utility program impacts, and post-COVID preparation. Next slide. So the state of the Midwest. Next slide. This slide is a rough timeline of how COVID has impacted the energy efficiency industry. First, starting in mid-March, we of course had the beginnings of stay-at-home orders. Customer protections on shutoffs and reconnections were many advocates' first priority. Throughout the region, we saw policies adopted to prevent shutoffs and to expedite reconnections. Some of these came through PUC orders, governor executive actions, or through individual utilities committing to consumer protections on a voluntary basis. Next, utilities began to stop their energy efficiency programs. In part, that was necessary to abide by the stay-at-home orders. While energy efficiency was allowed to continue on an emergency basis, like replacing non-working refrigerators, for example, many efficiency programs require face-to-face contact or at least entry into people's homes and businesses. While that may have been allowed under some stay-at-home orders in the region, the appetite for that dramatically decreased. So this has led utilities to innovate. We'll get into more specifics later, but through surveys, outreach, and conversations at stakeholder collaboratives, MIA has learned of utility innovation and began to compile this data. We saw the turn to virtual audits, contactless appliance pickup, and kits dropped off at food banks. Recently, we've seen some utilities return to field work in June, including DTE in Michigan and LGE KU in Kentucky. And lastly, in the last 6 weeks or so, we've seen utilities, regulators, and advocates come to the realization that COVID and its impacts on our industry will be felt for some time. Conversations have shifted to maintaining program continuity, increasing outreach and priority for those most in need, rebuilding the energy efficiency workforce, and increasing regulator flexibility in light of ongoing changes. Next slide. So on to the policy impacts of COVID. Next slide. Let's first recap what we've seen in Minnesota. This is not an exhaustive list. Dockets will continue to be opened up on COVID, and other routine filings will likely mention COVID's impacts. But first, we saw the Department of Commerce and the PUC issue a letter requesting utilities restrict disconnections, reconnect customers, waive late fees, and arrange payment plans. Recently, the PUC extended this request and solidified it into an order on June 18th for rate-regulated utilities. This order, issued in docket 20-375, mandated that utilities suspend disconnections for residential customers, suspend negative credit reporting, and waive late fees and interest for the duration of the peacetime emergency. In addition, this docket is a place for utilities to submit monthly reports on disconnections, length of disconnections, and total amount of arrearages. It also opened an inquiry on the possibility of cost recovery associated with COVID losses. We've seen dockets or investigations opened on potential cost recovery for utilities in several of our states in the Midwest, like Indiana, Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Missouri. One other docket of note is 20-492, which asked utilities how they and their infrastructure plans can contribute positively to Minnesota's economic recovery. Utilities responded to that request just a week or two ago in mid-June. I won't go into too much detail here, but the responses highlighted a willingness from utilities to expedite or increase infrastructure improvements in order to assist in job creation and economic recovery. Some utilities highlighted efficiency as a key component. This is a unique regulatory request compared to what we've seen in the region. Next slide. After a brief pause of session, the Minnesota legislature was able to continue conducting committee business via virtual hearings. While some legislatures in the region continued legislating by holding sporadic in-person voting sessions, the Minnesota legislature was a leader in figuring out how to conduct business remotely. The legislature did not weigh in on utility shutoff policies nor energy efficiency programs, which is typical of what we saw in the region. Like all other state legislative bodies, the Minnesota legislature focused on COVID response, which included distribution of federal relief funds, establishing guidance on returning to work, and renewing the governor's state of emergency. Some states in our region have mandated in statute that statewide energy efficiency collaboratives meet. These collaboratives are a way for utilities, commission staff, and advocates to come to the table to discuss energy efficiency policy and programs. While MIA takes part in many of these collaboratives year-round, like in Illinois, Missouri, and Michigan, we have found them to be especially useful in information sharing during this COVID crisis. Minnesota does not have a statewide collaborative, so instead we've seen most of the guidance come from the PUC, the Department of Commerce, and the WALS administration. Next slide. So here's a slide showing how statewide collaboratives responded to the COVID crisis. Michigan's collaborative convened in late March to hear how utilities and their programs were adapting to the new environment. This meeting, along with several ensuing collaboratives and low-income working group meetings, helped the utilities share best practices and have conversations with advocates and regulators about future program modifications. Illinois' Stakeholder Advisory Group and Missouri's Low-Income Advisory Collaborative have convened virtually as well. Next slide. In Michigan, these collaborative meetings led to the commission opening a docket to determine what innovation and coordination would be needed in order to keep energy efficiency programs running in light of COVID. This docket was unique in the Midwest. In addition to convening stakeholder meetings and conducting a utility survey, the order asked commission staff to draft a report with observations and recommendations for maintaining energy efficiency continuity. Next slide. Staff were asked specifically to address how the commission should handle utilities potentially missing their energy efficiency targets and how to identify best practices in serving under-resourced customers effectively. The PSC specifically highlighted the importance of the collaboratives in forming the content of the report. Next slide. The staff report was issued on June 15th. The main takeaway from the report is that utilities and regulators will require flexibility from each other. Regulators will need to consider program modifications and spend carryover. One possible suggestion from PSC staff was the combination of 2020 and 2021 goals, giving utilities more time to meet their goals, but not decreasing the target for energy savings over these 2 years. The PSC staff stressed the importance of energy efficiency and asked that utilities and the PSC continue to prioritize energy efficiency, especially since there will be a growing need for efficiency programs in under-resourced communities. The report concluded additional conversations need to take place 3 and 6 months from now. Next slide. And now I'll touch on some programmatic changes and innovations we've seen regionally. Next slide. These innovations are likely not new to you, but I'm sure the utilities will cover more of these in greater detail later. But to recap, initially in the earliest days of the crisis, we saw customer contact programs stop. In-home installations, audits, and evaluations were all paused. In the meantime, utilities turned their attention to continuing contactless programs. This meant continuing or enhancing rebate processing, online marketplaces, home energy reports, and building installations outside or in mechanical rooms. Next slide. We have seen recently utilities returning to on-site fieldwork. DTE in Michigan and LGE KU in Kentucky were some of the first returning to businesses and homes on June 1. Many utilities continued to queue customers for in-home work during the stay-at-home orders, so many have long lists of customers who are ready to welcome contractors into their homes. We are still seeing greater emphasis on the commercial and industrial side, since there is work to be completed in businesses, schools, and factories that are either empty or still at a diminished capacity. New construction energy efficiency programs like Wisconsin's Focus on Energy, New Construction, have ramped up again too. In-home residential services are gradually ticking back up. Work has been allowed to continue due to agencies disseminating guidance for utilities and contractors. Personal protective equipment is easier to come by now than it was in March and April. In addition, continued innovation like virtual home energy assessments and post-installation audits have limited the need for in-home contact in the first place. All of this is good news for ramping up energy efficiency programs again. Next slide. In general, programs for under-resourced housing are affected much like any other residential energy efficiency program. While we have seen these programs pause, we have also seen utilities supply more energy efficiency kits to under-resourced households, enhance collaboration with community action agencies, and add COVID-tailored marketing. It is important to note that under-resourced households are more greatly impacted by stay-at-home orders. Increased home energy use means increased utility bills. Thousands of households in Minnesota have experienced job loss and debt accrual. Additional and enhanced outreach will be necessary to reach these customers for energy assistance, weatherization, and energy efficiency programs. Many of these customers may have never accessed these programs before. We will need to see additional innovation to maintain program continuity for an enlarged under-resourced customer class. Next slide. On that note, we will need to see additional program innovation across all customer sectors. When utilities suspended or modified their programs in March and April, many of these decisions were taken under the assumption that COVID would only impact energy efficiency for a few months. Clearly, that's not the case. Regulators, utilities, and advocates will need to work together to find longer-term solutions for programs. We're now facing thornier issues in our industry. What percentage of customers will feel comfortable with work being completed in their home? How long will this discomfort last? Will customers be willing to take on bigger energy efficiency projects in a weakened economy? What about our workforce or liability? Next slide. Now we'll move on to our last section here. For those of you who tuned into Mia's COVID response webinar back in April, these slides will look familiar, but it bears repeating, not only because many of these recommendations are still relevant, but also in taking the long view of COVID, we need to be prepared to maintain energy efficiency continuity in light of a second wave of the virus or additional rounds of stay-at-home orders. While we have the green light and health and safety guidance for now, these guidelines will need to be continually updated by regulators and federal officials in light of new information and research. Next slide. I've mentioned it, but utilities and regulators will need flexibility. This is not a time to step away from efficiency, but flexibility in terms of program delivery, guidelines, timelines, and budgets will be necessary. Michigan is looking at combining goals for 2020 and 2021, giving utilities more time to reach the same amount of savings. Other states are allowing budgets to roll into next year. There are ways to creatively address the needs of utilities while not compromising the importance of efficiency. Next slide. Workforce issues are critical. Minnesota has lost about 8,500 energy efficiency jobs since the COVID crisis began, which is about 18% of the state's energy efficiency workforce. Efforts need to be taken to rebuild this workforce to meet the increased demand we're predicting in energy efficiency. While there are hopes that a federal stimulus could contribute funds toward the clean energy workforce, work can be done on the state level too. Next slide. And lastly, additional outreach will likely be necessary to explain the importance of efficiency at this time. We've seen utilities throughout our region change marketing to adjust to COVID response. The PUC 20-492 docket on utilities and economic recovery is great recognition by the PUC that utilities and efficiency have a role to play in the state's economic recovery. Beyond that, more customers may be considered under utilities income-based guidelines. Outreach will likely be needed to customers who have not previously qualified or applied under income-based guidelines. Efficiency programs should prioritize those most in need. Next slide. To wrap up here, MIA will continue to be a resource. We will continue to monitor and research COVID's impacts in our industry. Looking forward, MIA will keep tracking policy and program innovation, along with workforce, clean energy stimulus, and protection and promotion of efficiency. As a resource and convener, MIA will continue to engage all sectors of our industry and disseminate our findings to collaborative meetings like this and to our COVID response portal on our website. Next slide. That's all I have. Thank you for your time. Feel free to reach out to my email here or during the Q&A later. Thanks.
Thanks, Maddie. Now, Anthony Fryer and Jake McAlpine will give an overview of statewide discussions regarding the Conservation Improvement Program and safe work practices. Anthony and Jake.
Thanks, Ben. If we can go to the next slide. So, as Ben mentioned, I'm Anthony Fryer. I'm the supervisor for the Conservation Improvement Program in Minnesota. And before I sort of go into my update, I did just want to thank Ben and Catherine in particular for their leadership in this, in putting all of this together. They've really been the driving force behind it. And I'd also like to thank Mia and Maddie for the presentation they just gave and the work that they've been doing in order to provide regional perspective for what has been, a very uncertain few months here. For those of you that are not familiar, the Conservation Improvement Program in Minnesota is the implementation of the state's 1.5% energy efficiency resource standard. And we have about 120 electric and natural gas utilities that are required to meet that energy savings goal. For today, I just wanted to provide an update on utility program changes within the SIP program that we've seen over the last few months, and then just talk a little bit about what we've tried to do as the regulator of the Conservation Improvement Program in order to assist utilities at this time. So in terms of utility program changes, we were communicating with our utilities almost instantly when the statewide stay-at-home restrictions went into place, and had a number of requests in early April to change or to modify programs that included site visits to include or to be replaced by virtual site visits that included Centerpoint, Excel, and others. And the department approved those changes as quickly as we were able to, and provided conditional approval to those utilities in the with the proviso that they report back to us at the beginning of August, really just to tell us what they're seeing in terms of participation numbers, energy savings, and other program details compared to what they were expecting this year, so that the department can begin to get a better sense as to how site visit programs in particular were being affected during the COVID sort of shutdown. As in the state, restrictions have been reduced. We've also seen modifications for programs to include site visits that are done in accordance with state guidance, and where the participant can sort of determine the level of in-person interaction that they're comfortable with, and really try to provide the best experience for those customers. And we also saw a little bit of change in terms of rebate amounts on certain residential products to, I think, try and take advantage of many Minnesotans working from home and being able to address house projects that maybe had been put off for a while, and also to assist with any sort of economic impacts that the state was feeling from the shutdown. In terms of the Department of Commerce's approach during this time, similar to what Maddie listed in her recommendations for regulators, what we attempted to do was to reduce any unnecessary red tape for program modifications. We are guided by statutes and rules and previous guidance, but there is also flexibility within that construct as well. And we tried to make sure that where possible, any program changes related to the restrictions were reviewed and approved as quickly as possible, knowing that a sort of a day that modification sits in our office is a day that program isn't operating as effectively as it could. And so we hope that we would be able to provide sort of rapid response to those utilities looking to make those changes and really make sure that we were allowing those to go through as quickly as possible. The municipal utilities and our cooperative utilities all had filing deadlines on June 1st of this year, which many of them were able to still achieve. That was the results from last year and plans for next year. And where those utility representatives were finding it difficult to get that information submitted to the department, we attempted to provide as much flexibility as possible. And that also went for the investor-owned utilities as well. Their triennial plans for SIP for 2021 through 2023 were due June 1st of this year. We pushed that date back a month to today, actually, to allow for those utility representatives to have additional time to make sure they had those plans to the point that they wanted them to be before filing them with the department. We'll continue to monitor utility program design changes happening in other states with the help of MIA and ACEEE and others, and hope to communicate that where needed to our utilities. And then really, I think it's going to be not until the early part of next year that we really have a good understanding of what the impact of COVID on energy savings for 2020 has been and what it might look like for 2021 and going forward from there. So that's my update from the Conservation Improvement Program for utility representatives that are on the line. I'm sure you have my contact details. If you don't, I'll make sure that I get them for you, and please let us know if there's any additional assistance that you do require at this time. And so with that, I will turn it over to Jake McAlpine to talk more about the Weatherization program.
Thanks, Anthony. Next slide. So my name is Jake McAlpine. I supervise the Weatherization program for the Department of Commerce. And just want to give an update on how COVID and our response to COVID has gone over the past over 3 months now. The Weatherization Assistance Program is a income qualified program. It's funded from the federal level down to the state. And then at the state, we then contract with 23 community action agencies, tribal nations, nonprofits, local units of government around the state to provide the service to income qualified households. One of the elements that's important when talking about how in WAP we have responded to COVID is really the fact that the Department of Energy, which provides most of our guidance and rules, asks that our program focus its efforts on different categories of clients. So two of those categories are one is households that have people who are elderly in the home, and the other is households that have people with disabilities. So that mandate from the federal level makes the impacts of COVID, although incredibly serious, it adds a little bit to that for us. So the approach that we took was a collaborative approach to this. shortly after St. Patrick's Day, when the stay-at-home order, or shortly before, when the stay-at-home order went into place, we essentially stopped nearly all forms of work in clients' homes. We did allow for people to address, our service providers to address emergency situations. So we had some continuity of service, but for all practical purposes, the program stopped. We undertook a collaborative effort with our service providers to start digging into, as listed here, 6 different federal agencies, executive orders, and guidance from MDH, to pull that all together and to craft a safe work practices guidance that could be implemented by our service providers and their subcontractors or crews that go into homes to do these measures. So it was, we were cognizant of our authority and our role in this, in that we essentially at Commerce, we're not adding any new elements to that. What we were really digging into is kind of that phrase, follow all applicable federal and state rules. That can be a pretty deep hole to go down when you follow every link and chase it back through. So FEMA, FDA, EPA, there was some kind of referenced things that we had this group had to go into, pull that information and really bring it forward and summarize it, get it into a spot where we're not adding things to it, but pulling it together. We created some checklists, and we created a training, and we created and we referenced another OSHA training, and really tried to pull resources together for our network. So it was a nearly 2-month-long process that we concluded just recently. And so I'm going to take, I think, the next 4 slides here and step through a few of just the kind of highlights that I learned in talking to the people that were on that working group. So next slide. Just really generally speaking, to put it into broad buckets, the things that are different now that we've pulled these guidance pieces together is that we have pre-site visit client contact checklist or lists that we do before we get to the visit. We have a pretty detailed in-home safety plan, which really gives the general guidance to all workers that will be entering the home. What is the plan? How are we going to do this in a safe way and follow the OSHA guidelines and make sure that we're doing this. And there's a continuity from everyone in the chain that's going into the house. And then lastly, to help facilitate that, we have these daily checklists. For us, we have auditors, then contractors or crews that are coming in, and then finally an inspector coming in at the end of the process to verify things were done properly. So we created different checklists to help facilitate each of those worker types to facilitate their work and make sure that they have an easy reference to make sure they're hitting all the high points. Next slide. So with the pre-site visit checklist, number 1 is client ed. There's a lot of different things we can do in a phone conversation with a client to just start the conversation. We don't know where people are at with their understanding of COVID, so we start with client education, try to create a baseline between the auditor typically and the household. Then we have 3 series of screening questions. So there is a potential exposure screening questions. There's 3 of those. They deal directly with, are people in the home aware of contact essentially with anybody who has tested positive, international travel, and there's just basically 3 kind of short questions there. And then the next set of questions there is around symptoms. This is done multiple times throughout the process, but this is a series of 8 questions that really just kind of dive right into the nitty-gritty: chills, new cough, shortness of breath, and asking a series of questions if we have any of these, any people in the home that have any of these symptoms. And the key point here is that it's really about those symptoms that aren't related to another condition. So it's not that you couldn't have a cough. Is it a new cough? Is it not connected to a pre-existing condition? So that's really the kind of the next level of check. And then the third one is the in-home safety plan screening questions. So these really start to get into the hierarchy that OSHA lays out around how we're going to create that safety plan, that kind of strategy that you're going to have for that household. Next slide, please. So I'll go kind of one level down. I found this personally in talking with those, and there's a number of folks on the call right now that were in this working group. But this is, for me personally, one that was kind of an aha moment. And this is from OSHA, and it really talks about a strategy for approaching COVID and how to do that safely in the home. And that you have a range from, a most effective down to least effective. I personally, just in kind of going out and interacting in the world, seems like everything's PPE. There's, and that was the thing that was kind of on the forefront of my mind. And then kind of being educated about this, I found very interesting in that, that's the least effective, that we've got many, many more steps that we need to be putting in place before we get to PPE to ensure safety for those workers and the clients in the home. So, most effective is, can you eliminate it? Can we move the people? Do they have to be in the house? If there's an option where we can't, that's a really good strategy to remove the risk. I don't think substitution necessarily applies in this scenario, but the engineering controls, isolating people from the hazard. HVAC, can we, if you have forced air, can we shut the HVAC off or in the house? Can we start to do some of these engineering level things to reduce our risk to exposure? And then, administrative controls, can we change the way people work? So this is, you have a tool in your hand. Let's not set that down when we're in the house. Let's have these steps in place that are going to modify how we're working in the home that can help us reduce exposure. And then after we've done all of these, including social distancing, then that last step really is, what's the protection for the worker and or the person in the home. And there's not one clear path through that. It really depends on the type of work that needs to be done, the layout of the house, and the people in the home. What's their life? What things can they change? What things can't we change? And so there's a flexible point here where the auditor is taking that all into consideration and drafting an in-home safety plan that lays out how we're going to do this. So we're going to enter through one door. Is one entrance better than the other? Can we isolate people if they can't leave? There's a lot of different directions that this can go in. But this is done up front at the audit stage of the process, and the information then follows with the work order out to contractors and to the final inspector, so that we have continuity, that this plan is followed, and we really have our best chance of being safe. Next slide. And so this is to kind of just wrap it up. We have created these checklists for our network, and just some highlights. It's hitting some of those things that we want to make sure people aren't forgetting. So disinfecting, high touch surfaces, a final check on these screening questions. The questions get asked quite a bit by each time we're entering the home, we're asking those questions again because things change over time. So it needs to be dynamic and it needs to be updated. There's the safety plan I just mentioned. For the inspector at the end, there's a process where they're looking through and say, did we follow this? Did it work? Do we need to modify it? So there's a check that the plan not only was created, but that it was being used. And then we have hand hygiene and in things, social distancing and some of those other key elements that can be a part of the plan. So that's kind of just a bit of a summary of some of the work that we've done. Like I said, we crafted, or we pulled together all these pieces, tried to get it into one spot so that we could implement it. There's a 4-hour training that OSHA does around COVID, which I've heard people speak fairly highly of, that does a good job talking about weatherization type in-home work and COVID. And so we've put that out there. We've asked for our contractors and building show contractors in particular to take that training so that they have a deeper understanding of what we're dealing with on top of following all applicable federal and state guidelines. So that's the approach we took. The need is very great for comprehensive weatherization. So we're moving these elements into place. They are in place now so that we are able to meet some of these requirements, having the appropriate PPE and cleaning products on hand, have these trainings done, and so we can have this all in place. So now that we can get back into homes and start weatherizing. So with that, that is all I have. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Anthony and Jake. Now we will take about a 10-minute break. Feel free to stretch your legs or check email. And this would also be a good time to drop any questions you have for the presenters so far into the Zoom chat. So feel free to add those questions and we'll add them to our list on our end. During the break, please continue to make sure that your audio is muted and feel free to turn off your camera if it isn't already. And we will come back. We'll do a little bit more than 10 minutes. We'll just come back right at 1:55. So we'll see you all at 1:55 for the next round of presenters. All right, it is 1:55, so we are going to go ahead and get started again. Welcome back, everyone. Now that you've heard some regional and statewide perspectives, we'll now hear from 3 utilities on their responses to COVID-19 in Minnesota. So first is Emma Shoppy from CenterPoint Energy. And Emma, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ben. Can you hear me and see me okay?
Yes, we can. Thanks, Emma.
All right, thank you. I just have a quick 5-minute update, but I wanted to start by thanking Ben and the MMAHEN network for convening this meeting. It's so important, especially now, to be checking in with one another and hearing what everyone's doing. And we really value this opportunity and the chance to hear from all our stakeholders. Again, my name is Emma Shoppy. I'm the local energy policy manager with CenterPoint Energy. CenterPoint is the largest natural gas distribution utility in Minnesota with over 860,000 customers in 260 communities. We're also recognized for our longstanding and successful track record for delivering cost-effective energy savings programs for our Minnesota customers. In response to the coronavirus pandemic, CenterPoint has activated its pandemic preparedness plan and continues to monitor updates and follow protocols from the CDC, the World Health Organization, and state and local officials. To address the immediate needs of our customers in Minnesota, we are suspending non-emergency disconnections and waiving late fees. We are prioritizing and the reconnection of customers who were previously disconnected before the pandemic occurred. And because so many of our customers are facing hardships for the first time, we are using all media channels available to us to get information out about what services and funding opportunities we have available to help. To ensure we can safely engage with our employees, vendors, customers, and communities in achieving the benefits of energy savings, CenterPoint has made several modifications to the delivery of our conservation improvement program. In mid-March, when the governor's stay-at-home order went into effect, we put a pause on in-person audits, tune-ups, and direct install services. We partner with Xcel Energy in offering the Home Energy Squad and Multifamily Building Efficiency programs, which are our audit direct install programs that serve residential and multifamily building sector. Center for Energy and Environment is the implementer for Squad, and Energy Insights implements the multifamily program, for those of you that don't know. These 2 organizations worked really quickly and creatively to be able to offer a virtual audit service for these 2 programs. They also developed new pandemic safety protocols for when they are meeting with customers, and they made process improvements that help streamline our engagement with customers. In June, in-person visits and direct installs started back up for these programs, but we're continuing to solely market and make virtual visits and options for customers that want it. We're also continuing to just track these programs, but we have received positive feedback from customers, and we're seeing these programs in particular rebound after March and April. At this point, we really just want to help people get back on their feet. We have a lot of promotional offerings on the horizon, including increased bonus rebates for things like food service, equipment, tune-ups, steam traps, just to name a few, but there are many others. We are also looking at prebates to help customers with the upfront cost of insulation projects. This is something that our local government partners have been interested in for a while. And then we have a history of significantly exceeding our statutory requirements on our low-income SIP spending, and we're committed to continuing that trend to get us to 5.5 million spending by 2023, which is more than double our current requirement. That's my update. It's a lot, so please reach out to me if you have any specific questions or feedback. And I want to give a special thanks to CEE, Energy Insights, Excel, and the department for just working together and being responsive and creative and flexible in order to make these programs possible. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you, Emma. Next, we'll hear from Justin Johns at East Central Energy. Justin, go ahead whenever you're ready.
Well, good afternoon. Ben, can you hear me okay?
I can. You're a little bit faint, Justin, if you're able to maybe reposition your mic or...
All right, I'll speak up a little bit. How's
Great,
that?
thanks, Justin.
All right, next slide, please. So electric cooperatives are a bit different than the investor-owned and municipal utilities, and being non-regulated in regards to rates gives us some options for flexibility. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a bit, but I want to speak generally about the electric cooperative response to COVID and how it's impacted our SIP activity. Next slide, please. So East Central Energy is located in East Central Minnesota. We serve 61,000 members in East Central Minnesota and northwestern Wisconsin. And we're pretty spread out. So 7.2 members per mile of line is significantly lower than a lot of investor-owned utilities and municipals. And that leads to higher costs for our members in terms of electric bills. 14 counties in each state. And so we're uniquely positioned between the two. Next slide, please. So as COVID hit, like many organizations, we had to scramble and make some quick decisions about how we were going to deal with it as an organization. And our number one priority was the safety of our employees. And so we invoked our emergency response plan for a health crisis and tailored some of the tactics to things particular to COVID-19. Moved our employees all to work from home and in their home environment, closed all of our front offices, and we had our energy services folks not entering homes for at least 2 months. And we also voluntarily suspended disconnects for non-payment. I spoke with Annie Levinson-Falk shortly after things began with COVID, and kind of agreed with her right away that obviously we wanted to respond in a way that was compassionate to those who were going to be impacted the hardest. And in outstate Minnesota, I think things are a bit different. People look at things a bit differently when it comes to COVID. We don't have the cases that you may have in the metro area. And so sometimes it's a little bit more difficult for folks to understand up here what's happening in the metro. And I would add that the economic impact has been significant in this area. We have many healthcare workers who are furloughed and businesses that are shut down and employees not working. There's a lot of service jobs in this area. And with the lack of travel and the lack of activity in our area, it's impacted the economics of folks. And I want to talk a little bit later about, again, that flexibility piece and how we've been able to respond. Next slide, please. So the next thought after the safety of our employees was, how are we going to respond to our members' needs? How are we going to meet them where they are and provide the best service that we can? And I really appreciated Anthony and Jake's comments from DOC about SIP programs and the flexibility that's required and thinking about things a little bit differently maybe in the future. And so I want to reiterate that a little bit and kind of our perspective on that. We have a significant portion of our membership that's on a storage water heating program, electric water heaters that are controlled during the day when electricity is more expensive, and then they charge at night. And we were able to, through our wholesale power provider, Great River Energy, modify that program in a way that allowed people to have more hot water available during the day. With kids being at home throughout the day and people being home more, hot water usage is up a bit. And so those programs needed to respond to that. We were able to do that by changing the hours of control for that equipment. Capital credits, which is a payment of our excess margin back to our members. We've made some changes to that to help those that are struggling the most during this economic downturn for them. And so paying out capital credits earlier than we normally would have, we think is going to give people some opportunity to meet their needs a little bit better. We have a significant suite of 0% financing options for HVAC upgrades as well as plumbing projects. We don't perform credit checks, and we've had good luck with that so far. Our members it's an on-bill financing situation, but at 0% interest for many programs. And so that's been very popular. I think as people have continued or received stimulus checks, we've been able to bridge that gap to maybe purchase a new air conditioner or an air source heat pump or even furnace application. So it's been a great program and helped a lot of people, I think, during this time. And I've been working with Melissa Birch and Joel Haskard from the Clean Energy Resource Team recently on a project, low-income project that is going to involve visiting a local manufactured home park in our service territory. We'll be doing some pipe tape wrap and things of that nature, some low-cost initiatives that might open the door for further activity within those homes. And I just want to share one anecdotal story that we just dealt with yesterday. A gal that lives in our service territory and her daughter's 3 children. One of our energy services specialists was there for a high bill complaint. The gal had 4,500 kilowatt hours of use in a home. And for those who know anything about electricity, that's not obviously normal. And so Dave, the gentleman who was visiting, was able to ascertain the problem pretty quickly, because what it was is the bathtub in this woman's house, the faucet was broken. So the faucet was on all the time, which was the hot water faucet. And the water was not only running all the time, but the drain was broken. And so the water was running through the tub, into the floor, through the floor, into the basement. And this lady had lived this way for well over a month in this fashion. And so the energy services specialist, not a plumber, but he was able to shut off the water going to the water heater, which of course then shut the water off at the tub. And so because we have the flexibility to implement these programs in different ways than more regulated utilities, we were able to contact a plumber, have him stop over that day, get things taken care of for this gal, and just make her life a little better. She had racked up over a $600 electric bill just from having that water running constantly, and she had no resources, no way to fix the problem. So it's really nice as a cooperative to be able to respond to those kind of situations and have the flexibility to do so. And I think, as we think about conservation improvement programs in the context of COVID and the both health and economic impacts of it, I think flexibility is something that I would urge that we definitely keep on the table and look for ways to help those that have been marginalized and impacted the most throughout this situation. So that's what I have for today. Thank you, and I'll take any questions through chat or directly later. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Justin. And now we will hear from Paul Twite with Delano Public Utilities. Paul?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Say, one of the benefits of going at the end like this is you say ditto. Yeah, we got that too. So I'm not going to repeat a whole bunch of things, but I will say our main takeaway of the whole thing, while it's very tragic and very frightening, COVID-19 has really decomplicated and simplified our workflow like I never thought it would, let alone SIP, our accounting, just working from home. We're doing things differently. The new reality is we're doing things so differently now that a lot of these policies are probably going to change permanently. So that's kind of our big takeaway. In my career in the utility industry, for those who are not utility folks on the call here, in my career, I have never seen, I've never witnessed the communication, the internal communication. We're talking with other utilities, we're talking with our legislators, our regulators, co-ops are talking to munis are talking to Excel. Never, ever has this happened before in the past that I can tell. So I would say that's a little bit refreshing and kind of interesting. Anyway, I'm surprised on the call I've not heard, we've talked a lot about SIP, and we've heard about workflow changes. I'm surprised I haven't heard anybody talk about their own internal work policies, or for our sake, we're basically rewriting the employee handbook and our work policies to deal with COVID. And basically it's exposure and liability. If one of your employees returns to work and gets it, brings it to work and exposes someone else, who's the fault? Is it going to go to court? So we're starting over with our employee handbook to protect our staff and protect the organization. But anyway, again, the the biggest thing we're grappling with right now is what is the new reality going to look like. So anyway, as far as our conservation efforts, it's a good and bad news story. Great news is we're already at about 150% of our 2020 goal. We've been doing that. It's pretty easy because Delano is growing pretty quickly. Bad news is, as everybody has stated, our customers, our residential customers, low-income customers, even some of our industrial customers are really, really struggling financially right now. So, you know, we're in kind of a situation where we've been lucky. We've dodged a couple bullets. Our business customers are relatively healthy. We have loan programs just like everyone else does, prepaid loan programs, you know, prebates, all that kind of stuff. But we're kind of bracing ourselves, as well as many utilities are kind of bracing themselves for the onslaught of bad debt that we expect is going to be coming. Evictions and bad debt are probably the two scariest things right now in the utility world. The other thing we're dealing with a little bit, while some of you I've heard are seeing a kind of an uptick or a swing back, we still see consumer confidence is pretty sketchy right now. So we don't see anybody, let alone low-income folks, going out and buying, you know, Energy Star refrigerators. So we're working to forward our objectives to them, whether it be an on-bill loan repay program or something like that, to kind of grease the skids to get it going again. But anyway, again, I'm going to echo what some of the previous speakers said. No touch, no boundary, or you can do everything over a cell phone, email, website. There's no reason to talk to one another face to face. So all of our documents are available either by email, online, call us, we'll mail them to you. All of the site visits, all the engineering consultation is all online. One of the changes we made that I don't think I heard anybody clarify is that we stopped any measurement and verification on any custom rebates. We're going to take best engineering numbers, widely accepted engineering practices, and we're not going to measure anything, the performance of anything. Like others, we're crediting the rebate. We're not writing checks. It's going right to their electric account. So there is literally, because you heard Jake a while ago talk about the COVID steps, we adopted step 1, 2, and 3, which was eliminate our crew and our staff from the virus or the risk. We adopted those on day 1. So our process is completely virtual, no paperwork whatsoever. So anyway, again, I know a lot of you are different roles in the utility industry, but rest assured, the utilities have never been talking as much as they are right now. So that's all I got for you. That's my elevator pitch. Thank you to everybody. Send me an email or write me a letter. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Paul. Now to share some of the housing impacts from COVID-19 in Minnesota, I'll turn it over to Metric Giles from Community Stabilization Project. Metric, feel free to take it away. Metric, if you're talking, you might need to unmute.
There we go. All right. Hello, everyone.
Hi, Metric.
It's been really interesting what I have been hearing. Community Stabilization Project. We work with renters, property dwellers, otherwise known as tenants, and with the property owners. And our goal is renter stability will lead to community stability. So part of that situation is transparency and clarity. And a big piece of that is what are the policies that governs that relationship from that perspective. What we know right now is that 80% of home ownership is European. And we really do a focus on that 80%, the opposite 80% that is non-home ownership, which is Black, Indigenous, and people of color, as well as Europeans that are also living in non-livable and non-quality of life situations. And so when we think about that, the question I'm asking about, as we talk about COVID and the impact, is what is really governing this situation? That we're talking about. Are we talking about COVID and George Floyd and responding to that, or are we responding to addressing institutional and structural policies that has impact on these Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and as well as the Europeans that are not living in that quality of life? And I would say that it's great that we have all this response to COVID, but I have heard some really good things on the call today, but I'm also seeing that it's a part of trying to create something to sustain the present situation that we're in versus trying to regenerate to say, well, hey, the situation that we're in did not start with COVID or George Floyd and the response to George Floyd. That we was in a situation that we kind of like have policies and programs that was based on actually trying to have the most least people having to even become more least or more or less with incentives to qualify for subsidized programs, and especially when we talk about the energy piece of it. And so I would like to say, that what we have right now is great, but how do we, number one, change from having not sustainable programs, but how do we have programs and initiatives, applications that are about investing in people that is regenerative? And so when we talk about those type of things, we need to have an inclusive opportunity that produces stability, that provides investment, and then a return on that investment. And that needs to be a mutual investment for the renter as well as the homeowner. And so how do we get back to that piece? And one of the things that I'm going to recommend for everyone that is on this call, because at the end of the day, it's about policies, is that I'm going to recommend that everybody read this book that has been that I keep repeating because it's really important for me to understand the history that relates to where we are today, which is called White Rage. So I'm asking anyone to take a look at White Rage. And it's about, by the author Carolyn Anderson, I think her name is. But it's through that process of understanding that we can no longer to continue with the policies and the practices, and that we have to have very interactive systems working together. Well, CSP, we have about 40 units that we rent from the property owners. We feel that we cannot have healthy renters without having healthy property owners as well. That we need to be in relationship and that there's a mutual investment for both of them. So with these different properties, we're finding out that, and these are from 4 units or less. We also work with larger units as well, but where we're able to rent from the property owner and then move beyond some of these barriers that the renters was having. We also find out that these renters, we also need to educate them that this is an investment for them as well. And I heard someone refer to the water. So it's like, where do we have inroads to the renters that actually validate their living situation? And I like the fact that people are saying where people are staying at home, they're actually utilizing more utilities. So with that, how can we address like something that is very fundamental to our renters, you know? And so when COVID is over, or the response to, you know, how we're all responding to the George Floyd thing, which is about Black Lives Matters, because I am saying that 80% of Black people, Indigenous, and people of color are the renters that we're talking about. That when this is over, we have moved beyond saying, well, we did what we had to do because of COVID. And we're saying we're doing what we're doing now because we were lacking in what we should have been doing in the beginning. And when COVID hit, or the situation with George Floyd, it accelerated a situation that was already bad. So how do we do that? I'm saying we do that again through the policies, that we have to really have policies that is interactive with the different systems, that is not only interactive, is that the people who are the most impacted are the ones who also needs to be part of those conversations that leads to the policy outcomes that will be impacting them. There's a lot I can say in the 10 minutes, but the main thing I just want to say is we cannot think that the work that we're doing is about sustaining and a response to COVID-19, or even or to the George Floyd thing. The reason it's so bad is because we wasn't collectively engaging and being equitable in the policies that we are now practicing. You know, such as if renters, and 80% of renters are people of color, and they're paying rent to the utilities, and maybe in some places it counts, it will show up on my credit rating as a negative, but will it show up as a positive on my credit rating when I pay my bill? Or we're hoping that we can work with the DSI, Department of Safety and Inspections, that when they come out and energy efficiency become part of the criteria for certificates of occupancy. And we know that will be probably more of an expense. We also have that value of the responsibility of doing good is to do no harm or the least harm. So that becomes another value with every program and initiative we do. So hopefully, I'm just trying to plant some seeds that we take care of people right now during COVID, but even more so that we move to beyond this subsidizing some and investing in these other folks. Or, you know, like with the utility companies. At the end of the day, the money that they put into the energy programs actually gets recycled back to them every year when they provide a subsidy for a family to pay for the utility bills that they couldn't meet. You know, how do we make sure that these homes are interactively weather-wise so that we can make it more inclusive and not based on a subsidy, that we all have energy efficiency as a universal right, you know, and quality of life. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Metric. We've had a couple of questions coming through the chat. I'd like to maybe just pause for a minute or two and let folks, you know, kind of think and reflect back on the presenters so far. Feel free to add any questions that you have at this point into the chat. I've been sorting through the ones that we've gotten so far, and we'll start asking our presenters questions based on what we've already seen come through. But maybe we'll just take a quick minute or two. Please feel free to drop any questions you have at this point in the chat, and we'll start asking questions in just a couple of minutes. Great. I'm seeing maybe one or two more questions coming in. Please feel free to add questions as you think of them, but we'll go ahead and just get started with Q&A, and I'll try to direct them to some of our presenters, and feel free to add questions in the chat as you think of them. So the first question that came through in the chat is for Anthony and Jake, and any of our utility presenters who want to add as well. But the question is kind of twofold. So for utilities, how will you be able to meet your statutory SIP requirements or your SIP goals, depending on the utility, given the economic downturn and changes in energy use and habits, as we've talked about? And for commerce, you've touched on commerce's role, Anthony and Jake, as the state regulator, and your efforts to provide flexibility during this time. And for you all, if you could expand on how additional flexibility might be needed as the utilities file their new SIP plans, and how that performance will be measured, especially given the economic downturn and changes in energy use in future years, and what that flexibility would look like. So kind of a two-part question for both utilities and commerce, but any perspectives you have to share for the 5 of you, that would be great.
Hi, this is Emma from Centerpoint. I can kick it off. In terms of us meeting our statutory requirements at this point in June, there's still a lot of uncertainty, but given that we have a diverse portfolio and a number of programs, I can say that some are doing okay right now. Certainly for SWAD and multifamily building efficiency, those activities were slowed down in March and April and May, but they're picking back up in June, and we're continuing to keep an eye on it and see how it goes. But right now, I guess we feel like we have some flexibility there, but there's not a whole lot of detail I can give on the overall portfolio at this point.
Yeah, this is Anthony, just from the sort of Department of Commerce SIP point of view. Similar to what was just said, really, we sort of want to know or get a better handle on what the impact of COVID is on SIP programming, but before we talk about serious changes and the magnitude of those changes, to make sure it's sort of commensurate with what the actual impact is, and that it's and that ultimately it's helpful for the utilities and for the SIP program. In terms of what flexibility might look like, statutorily we can reduce savings goals down to 1%. The commissioner has the authority to do that in consultation with the utility. As I mentioned earlier, we've got flexibility in modifying programs and working with utilities to do that. And I think the final point is that, I think if savings for 2020 are lower than have been seen in previous years, or lower than how we've been tracking over the last 5 to 10 years, there's certainly going to be acknowledgement from the department that this has been a particularly unique and trying year for utilities, and I think that's going to be illustrated in savings results from around the country as well. So our focus is certainly on helping utilities in the ways that we're permitted through statute, and certainly focus on that as opposed to sort of drawing a line at 1.5%. Yeah, so that's my response to that.
I can just pitch in to a little bit, just kind of from a weatherization perspective. So the question might not apply to us in our program in the exact same way, but as far as flexibility, there are being driven largely by federal rules. The Department of Energy has offered as much flexibility as they're able to. It's interesting in a time like this to see where things can easily change and where things, in our case, there's a couple elements that literally take an act of Congress to change based on how they were written. So there's some elements that aren't able to change quickly or easily, some that were. So for our program, today is the first day of our new program year. So we're in a different situation than the utilities on a calendar year. This hit us in the last quarter of the previous year. The Department of Energy has allowed us to combine 2 program years together. So some of the targets that we would not have been able to meet over the last 3 months, they've allowed us another year to do that. We've, at Commerce pass along that flexibility as we can get it from the federal level. And I think it's being that we're at the beginning of a program year, it's just going to be a lot of communication with our network and hearing what their needs are. We're very open to making this work. So it's just going to be a process of constant check-in, essentially, to make sure we're up to speed on what the conditions are on the ground as they change.
This is Justin from East Central Energy. Just from a cooperative perspective, as far as meeting the statutory SIP requirements, a big portion of our spending and our kilowatt-hour savings comes from the commercial side of that operation, and particularly the savings have come from that area. And so with a lot of businesses shuttered and closed, they're reopening now, but it's looking like we might be heading back in the wrong direction with that regard, and so that's disconcerting for sure. However, in a sense, it comes down to who do you serve, and as a cooperative, we're owned by the people that we serve, and so our goal is to meet their needs, and so we're going to tailor our programs and use the flexibility that we can to meet the most dire needs and help the people who are, again, most impacted and marginalized by this situation. And so as far as meeting the SIP requirements, I think the spending requirement won't be an issue. And we are fortunate that we're able to aggregate through our wholesale power provider, Great River Energy. 28 cooperatives are able to, well, a portion of them anyway, are able to aggregate their activity. And so that helps buffer for those who are maybe having a tough time meeting it. The need is definitely there, but when we start looking at kilowatt-hour savings, deemed savings and things of that nature, it can be a stretch to get these things done. And we want to focus on doing what's the best for the people while doing the best we can to meet those statutory requirements. And so trying to get those in alignment is probably an important part of this conversation, to make sure that statutory requirements and program design lines up with the needs of the public.
I guess I would, speaking for the other side of the public power industry, municipals, public power in general, according to the state SIP statute, the power of the aggregation is really key. So many municipals choose to aggregate their SIP efforts together, much more efficient, yada, yada. Delano itself, we've chosen to divorce ourselves from that process, but for other reasons. But I believe you're going to see going forward to meet these goals, you're going to see public power banding together, public power being nonprofit utilities, co-ops and municipals. You're going to see us banding together in ways never before even thought of.
Thank you all. That was really helpful. And I think shifting gears a little bit, wanted to follow up on that with another question from the chat. So I think we've talked about the need for flexibility and adjustments that are being made during the pandemic. But looking down the road, looking to the future, and Justin, I know you mentioned the need to really be mindful of those customers who are most impacted and marginalized. There was a question in the chat on how utilities and agencies are thinking about how to ramp up and better target programs to these communities in the future. So making the point that energy efficiency in particular can be key to long-term energy affordability when those programs are comprehensive and targeted. And relatedly, how SIP programs can be better paired with with bill assistance programs relatedly. So again, kind of an open question to commerce folks as well as the utilities, but wanted to also ask about kind of how these programs might be thought of going forward after the pandemic and through the recovery period.
So I'll jump in on this one again. We have a close relationship with our CAP agencies, community action partners. And so our member services department works closely with the CAP agencies on bill assistance and things of that nature. And we actually have programs where caring members program, it's called. And so some of our members who are a little bit more affluent are able to donate and give money to other members. And so administering those programs becomes really a matter of prioritization and working through that. As far as SIP programs and pairing those with bill assistance, I think one of the things that we do is as a smaller cooperative, 160 employees, I know the gal who oversees our collections. And so we work hand in hand on trying to line up SIP dollars for energy assistance to someone who's struggling to pay in their bills, because the cheapest kilowatt hour is the one that you don't have to buy. And so trying to make sure that we're aware of the people that are struggling is probably the first step. And so identifying them and then providing them with resources really about internal communication within our organization and making sure that we are catching those people before they fall through the cracks.
And I'll add to that too. So with weatherization, a bit of just kind of background. We serve roughly about 2,000 households a year. So I think, and we also have a pretty extensive waiting list for our services based on the amount of funding we have. So the waiting list, in a lot of ways, it's a requirement at the federal level to ensure fairness to people that are asking for the program. It's an income qualified program, as I mentioned earlier. All expenses are covered by the program for the tenant or the homeowner. And there's some new there's a reauthorization at the federal level for weatherization that includes language that's starting to open that up to allow for more community-based approaches. And allow for, and there's a number, it would have some benefits all over the states. I think in rural areas, one thing we hear about is just the distance that our service providers have to travel to be able to provide services. And if you have a waiting list in a multi-county area, you may literally be crossing day after day, going to all different parts of it and not able to really cluster as well. Or do an outreach effort in a community. That would also have impacts in the cities too, around being able to focus efforts on certain neighborhoods that are disproportionately being affected by any number of things. So we're excited to see where that goes. We hope that reauthorization gets passed. It's I believe last I heard it had been approved by both House and Senate, and it's essentially waiting to get taken up on a bill and passed through. So we're hopeful that there are some changes at the federal level that allows for more of that flexibility. And I think the other one, just kind of tangentially, is in order to get energy, to get weatherization, we partner with the Energy Assistance Program to do the income verification for that. So as far as outreach to different groups that are being affected disproportionately, a lot of that comes down to outreach, or a factor there is outreach within the Energy Assistance Program. And I know they do quite a bit of effort at the local level to ensure that outreach is happening in an equitable way, and tracking at the state level to make sure that those sort of things are happening. So I think the last one I'd add is just, it's difficult to do neighborhood and community approaches unless you have sufficient funding to do that. So I think an expansion of any of these types of programs towards that effort really helps to be able to have that impact as well. So.
Sorry, Anthony, were you gonna speak? I'll defer to you first.
Okay, thanks, Emma. I mean, just I think trying to respond to the first part of Laura's question about under-resourced low-income customers, especially in the Black and Brown communities. From the SIP point of view, our focus over the last decade has been on sort of low-income programming in general, and less targeted towards specific communities. A few things I would sort of add to that. I mentioned that the IOUs have submitted their triennial plans today or by the end of today. And I would certainly encourage stakeholders on this particular webinar to look at those plans, and especially the plans regarding low-income customers, and examine those plans based on Laura's question there, and ask the utilities the questions as to what should be done in terms of assisting those communities that have been neglected in either in past plans or over the last decade. And so I would certainly encourage stakeholders to do that, and I think that that is also something that applies to the Department of Commerce, and the SIP program is re-examining where our emphasis is with regards to low-income spending, and being more targeted in how we assist utilities in designing their programs, and identifying where the need is in Minnesota for these programs, and where is it missing the mark. A couple of things that I think are good starting points that we've done this year. We've funded a program that is looking directly at the impact of the SIP program within tribal communities, and more importantly, where SIP has either failed or missed the mark with those tribal communities. We've also had discussions in recent weeks with utilities about ways in which SIP programs can be used to help rebuild the Lake Street area, and repair and rejuvenate that over the unrest of the last few weeks. And so that's certainly where my mind is at the moment with regards to the SIP program. But I think with utilities, and certainly with the department, plenty of work ahead to improve.
I think the others covered it really well. I just wanted to add that an effort that we had been looking at, well, we're working on, and it has been in the process since before the COVID pandemic. We're developing a tool to map our SIP participation levels against census demographics. So looking at where our programs are being deployed and where we're falling short, we think this will be a great tool to have more direct conversations with communities, even at the micro level, neighborhood organizations, or whoever is interested in just knowing how programs are being deployed across our service territory, and what can be done to increase levels where we're missing the mark, particularly in Black and other people of color communities. And I guess I'll leave it there. If you have questions on that effort, I can follow up. Thanks.
Thanks, Emma. And just to wrap up this question, there's a response from Paul with Delano Public Utilities in the chat. referring to many municipal utilities not recognizing or tracking under-resourced or low-income customers due to limitations and restrictions placed on utilities. So generally defaulting to county programs. So thank you for that input as well, Paul. And thank you all for your responses as well. I wanted to ask the next question for Metric. Metric, you talked about the need to move beyond just sustaining people and sustaining programs, and instead moving toward investing and regenerating. And I'm hoping that you could either provide some examples of what that might look like, or talk about some potential strategies to move toward those more connected and intertwined and interactive systems that you talked about during your presentation.
Hello, yes. So one of the questions I put in to the chat, I don't know if it reached you or not, was the question to the utility companies. As we look at our representation of workforce, when I talk about interactive systems, what is the representation of your workforce? I mean, in relationship to the people that you say are in the most need. Do they have actual opportunities to become part of the workforce? And I'm thinking at all levels, versus just saying, well, we only interact and have that relationship with you through, the customer consumer level. The other thing I would just reference is one of the things, our language also has an impact on our processes that we use. And most of the processes that we use, we're not even conscious of them because they had been practiced for so long. So my brother said to me one day, he said, do you know about the Homestead Act? And I said, yeah, I know about the Homestead Act, where you had all these people on the line going out to get the land, all this free land, where in reality, this free land actually belonged to the indigenous people. All the people on the line was all white people. And it's like, so when we reference stakeholders, I think we have very good intentions, but understanding the historical application of stakeholders. There's some folks starting with beyond Columbus who have the states, and there's other people who are where the states are being pushed into. So when I think about investment, it's like, is what you're doing today, and this is the same question that we ask some of our customers who comes in and needs some assistance in paying a utility bill or paying for rent or something. How will you be able to take care of this situation tomorrow? And if they say, well, tomorrow we're going to go out and look for another subsidy or another program that can provide assistance, then we say, well, okay, maybe right now we need to go into a different direction. That there's another situation that is happening that will allow you to not keep sustaining from day to day, but provide some opportunities for some investment in yourself. I don't know if that helps a little bit without going into depth.
That's great. Thank you, Metric. I really appreciate that perspective and definitely some important points. There was another question in the chat. I think this is probably for Anthony and Jake. And it was from Kevin asking, our utility would like to look into a process of assisting under-resourced, otherwise known as low-income apartments or households through SIP. We would like to pursue spending of LED lighting fixtures ourselves. Are there any resources or funding that would be helpful to assist landlords or under-resourced, otherwise known as low-income homeowners with labor cost? Anthony or Jake, would you want to take that question?
Sure. I mean, I'd certainly be happy to talk offline and provide at least examples of similar utility programs around the state that may be a good sort of starting point to get a handle on what the program would need just to meet the meet the state requirements. But for low-income programming in general, I think there's within statute there's a lot of flexibility, and we've got a lot of incredibly active utilities out there that have done, I think, some very innovative programming for low-income customers. So would certainly be happy to offer the department's help with that. And then I think there's a number of other people on this call with some great expertise in this sort of program design.
Great. Thank you, Anthony. And just to update the chat here, Alexis shared a reaction, being excited about the greatly increased communication that Paul talked about, and also being excited about the regenerative programming that Metric referred to as well. So Alexis, thank you all for your insights. And then Emma, responding to Alexis's question on the pandemic preparedness plan, mentioned that CenterPoint has had a pandemic preparedness plan in place since 2009, though there may have been earlier versions. So thank you all for the discussion in the chat. I wanted to ask, kind of working off of Paul's presentation, but really a question for all of the utility representatives. Paul referred to this idea of a new reality. I think that was your language, Paul. So I just wanted to ask Paul, Justin, and Emma, we've talked about this new reality due to the COVID-19 pandemic and some of the adjustments that you've made. What aspects of that new reality do you expect to carry on even after the recovery period, say, 5-10 years in the future? How does our new reality show up going forward and well into the future as you see it?
Shall I go first?
Go ahead, Paul.
So yeah, I didn't mean to be corny, or I just, in tragedy, there's, you find efficiencies, and this pandemic, whether you had a contingency plan, an emergency plan, or whatever, good stuff bubbles to the surface. I don't know how else to express it. So we just sort of organically figured out how to clean up, simplify, or as health insurance companies like to say, decomplicate some of these processes that utility companies, these programs that utility companies love to make complicated programs and brochures and things like that, and have meetings. And we just said, this is not necessary. We're doing well. Again, we're in a bit of a unique situation where we're north of 150% of our goal for this year. So in other words, we're working on populating next year's SIP, much to Anthony's delight, I'm sure. But anyway, we realized we don't need a lot of this clutter. If a customer takes pictures of receipts with their smartphone and scans it, sends it to us, I know that new 20-ton rooftop unit is going to yield a certain amount of kilowatt hour savings. I don't need to set up meters and measure and verify things. And so we've just really, we've eliminated the paperwork. So we're using energy platforms. So there's not even a rebate form to fill out. We're doing it online in the state database. And I don't know, I think this is going to be the new reality for us. We're not going to go back to, and I realize there's lots of energy service companies on the call, so I got to be considerate here and nice. But I don't think we're going to go back to complicated stuff, paperwork and a lot of site visits and meetings and things like that. So in regards to SIP, I think it's really going to simplify it, make it a lot more efficient. And I think our biggest challenge is just going to be figuring out how to stay in touch with our customers, let them know that we're still here, let them know that we still have options. That's our biggest challenge.
I think Paul put that really eloquently. Certainly, we've found some efficiencies in our program offerings. We've had the time to kind of reevaluate how things are being done and improve how they're being done. As an example, Energy Insights relayed that they've found efficiencies in terms of the multifamily building program and being able to essentially decouple the audit and the direct installs. So they're just able to coordinate more effectively with the customer and reduce lag time on that approach. Some of the things that we see could potentially stick around, although it's still early in the process and we're still tracking and evaluating. For the Home Energy Squad, the virtual audits seem to be doing pretty well for certain customer types. I mean, for a lot of customers, there isn't really a need for somebody to be on site looking at every single detail of their home. They might have a quick question, and that can be accommodated and sussed out really quickly in the virtual audit offering. So those are some of the things that we see continuing to move forward in terms of those programs.
Yeah, I think the other two both have really summed up a lot of the message and the future for, I think, utilities in general. Cooperatives are in the same boat. Our wholesale provider, Great River Energy, is putting together some reporting software and it integrates with our customer information system, which allows people to interact with us in a more real-time situation. Requiring young members to print out rebate forms and mail them is probably something they're not interested or capable of doing if they don't have a printer at their house. And so, you know, making these programs more accessible to younger generations is going to be important. And you know, just becoming more nimble and more responsive to the needs of our community is important. And I think a lot of this comes down to relationships. And so while we've distanced ourselves socially in real life, I think it's given us an opportunity to slow down and establish relationships with our CAP agencies, participate in WebExes like this that allow us to think differently maybe about these programs that we've talked about, and find ways to be a life raft for some of these people who are suffering the most during these times. And so I appreciate as well Metric's comments, and it, you know, as someone who lives north of the metro, it's not exactly a pool of diversity up here in terms of race. And so it's just really interesting for me to listen to that commentary, and I do appreciate that perspective. So you know, we're just going to try to listen to our members and try to respond to them and meet them where they are and provide the resources that we can to make their life a little bit better. That's our charge as a cooperative, as a member-owned utility, and so we're going to try to do that as effectively as we can. That's what we're going to continue to do after this pandemic.
Great. Thank you all. I think we have time for one last quick question, and I wanted to ask Maddie, just building off of the answers we just heard from Paul, Emma, and Justin. Maddie, you shared kind of a regional perspective of innovations and adjustments that have been made. From your perspective, looking regionally across the Midwest, have there been any innovations or adjustments that you're expecting to continue, or things that you're seeing in other states that we might be thinking about, or eventually seeing here in Minnesota?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the under-resourced communities, the programs directed there, I can't really point to any one thing that we've seen. I can just say in general, this has already been echoed, the increased collaboration and conversation and flexibility is something that we've seen in other states. And I think having something like this is a really good start to kind of share best practices. I will say that the turn to virtual, both in audits and in any kind of work in the home, I think we're definitely going to see that expand and stay maybe even beyond this pandemic era. Yeah, I mean, we're continuing to watch, and I think dockets will continue to emerge, and we'll see innovation through that as well. And I think some of them that I pointed out in Michigan are something that we could see replicated in Minnesota. But yeah, just keeping an eye on what we'll see throughout the region still.
Great. Thank you, Maddie. All right, we are right at the end of our time, right at 3 o'clock. So I want to thank all of our speakers today, and again want to thank our partners and co-hosts for all of their contributions to this webinar. And thank you all for attending. We will send an email out following today with information on how to access this recording, as well as a registration link for our July 15th follow-up discussion forum, where there will be plenty of opportunity for everyone to interact more beyond our limited Q&A this afternoon. Please feel free to contact me with any questions, and thank you again for attending. Bye, everyone.
Bye, thank you.